Well, for those of you just joining us, we're starting our fifth session of today's day of military law training here at the National Lawyers Guild Convention. We're excited for everyone who's joining us. Our first presenter is for sharing something that he recorded, so I'm going to switch over to that computer to do the share screen thing, and we'll play that video, and from there we'll move on with our other speakers for this session. So let me real quick make my other account a co-host so I can share a screen and turn off the sound over here so I don't have feedback, and then we'll watch David Gespass. And by the way, just give you an introduction for David. And as Aaron mentioned earlier, David is one of our oldest longtime members of the, not literally oldest, but one of the members who's been with us the longest. He was one of the co-founders of the Military Law Task Force and was part of the National Lawyers Guild Military Law Office during the Vietnam War. He practices law in Alabama. So let me go ahead and get that video queued up, and we'll go from there.
Every generation needs to learn its own lessons, often thinks it has insights and experiences that are not just new, but have sprung up out of nowhere. It's a weakness of youth. But nothing, at least since the Big Bang, comes from nothing, and learning from the past is the best way to move forward. As Angela Davis pointed out, every generation stands on the shoulders of those who have gone before, and that means the new generation can see further if it makes use of those shoulders. For my generation, particularly among students, the massive opposition to the Vietnam War may have appeared novel, if not unique. But there's always been opposition to war generally, and imperialist war particularly. History shows that when countries fight, they are rich men's wars and poor people's battles. The fact that we now have a so-called all-volunteer military does not change that. But conditions in the military reflect the problems of society, and the effects of those problems are often magnified when you're the tip of the spear. That means that when there's dissent in the civilian sphere, there will be dissent in the military, and the dissent there will be dealt with more harshly, precisely because as U.S. economic domination declines, military might is ever more relied upon by U.S. imperialism to maintain its dominant position in the world. And that means that military dissidents' needs for effective representation are as greater than the needs of striking workers or people protesting the torture and murder of George Floyd or Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. Indeed, opposition to the Gulf War was built inside and outside the military. Few join the U.S. armed forces in hopes of fighting. They join because they need jobs or they want training, and recruiters sell them on those things, not mentioning their primary responsibility is war fighting. My generation may have thought that the anti-Vietnam War GI movement was unique, but it had antecedents as well. Most notably, the back home movement after World War II, with the government attempting to move troops from Europe to Korea to stop Chinese expansion, was met with massive opposition, both within the military and at home. Eventually, the U.S. was forced to accede to the demands of the movement and bring the troops home. After the Russian Revolution and Russia's exit from the war, Wilson's attempt to deploy troops to fight the Bolsheviks, ill-conceived and incoherent, sparked similar protest. That history is often lost because the U.S. government doesn't want to hear about it. The most important element of Vietnam's victory over the U.S. was the resistance of the Vietnamese people. Second most important was resistance within the ranks, and that resistance was not limited to draftees. Soldiers refused to fight, would even kill officers who tried to lead them into combat. Others deserted, and there were those who also organized. FTA tours, popularly called Free the Army, which is 2/3 right, were more popular than U.S. tours. They included people like Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland, Barbara Dane, who you're listening to today, and Holly Near. In response to and support of GI resistance, coffee houses sprung up around the U.S. and in Asia, particularly Japan, where many deserters fled. That was the genesis of the military law office, the brainchild of Eric Seitz, who also coincidentally introduced me to the Guild when he was our executive secretary. The function of the offices was to supplement the work of the coffee houses by providing legal support to resistors and providing civilian counsel to service members. Its effectiveness was highlighted when the office in the Philippines was raided by the Philippine government, its files seized, and its staff arrested and deported at the behest of the U.S. government. The war was winding down when we arrived in Japan towards the end of 1973, but tensions and problems remained. We were in Yokosuka, where the aircraft carrier Midway had recently been home-ported. This was a particularly significant issue for the Japanese for reasons I'll get into. Before that, I will mention that we were banned from the base except to see clients or for courts martial or other legal proceedings the day we arrived. But over the 13 months we were in Japan, our presence grew. We would distribute our newspaper on the bar strip within a few months. It was paying for itself through donations from sailors, and a corps of sailors regularly wrote most of the articles. Many others would take the paper, were worried about the consequences of being seen with it, and would read it surreptitiously. That fear was heightened when one of our regulars disappeared after openly reading the paper on the deck of the Midway. Turned out he was shipped back to the U.S. that day and eventually wrote an article about what happened to encourage others to be more open and aggressive about their actions, explaining he was not charged or disciplined, just sent home. Much of the work was counseling, advising people of things like the process for seeking conscientious objector status, how to file complaints through the Article 138 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and, of course, courts martial and non-judicial punishment procedures. The big case we had there was when some 50 or more Midway sailors chose not to board for a cruise. Missing ships movement is serious, could be charged as a felony. If you miss work as a civilian, you might get disciplined or fired. If you miss work as a military member, you could be convicted of a criminal offense. The men who didn't board the Midway were charged in special courts martials who are only facing misdemeanors. There have been talk for some time about the terrible conditions on board for enlisted personnel and talk about just not sailing with the ship. Like Kathy Johnson, another lawyer from our office, represented one sailor. The offense was that in violation of the Status of Forces Agreement with Japan, the Midway had nuclear weapons. That was big news in Japan, where people had a curious aversion to nukes. Therefore, we argued, the order to board the ship was illegal, and every member has not just the right, but the duty to refuse illegal orders. Anyway, this was of great interest to the Japanese press, which covered the proceedings. The motion to dismiss, of course, was denied. Our client then pled guilty in accordance with the pretrial agreement. In extenuation and mitigation, the sentencing phase of the court-martial, when asked why he didn't board, he said it was because of the weapons. The judge immediately halted the hearing, met, as I recall, ex parte, with the prosecutor, returned, and closed the courtroom, sending Japanese reporters on their way. Ultimately, the conviction was reversed. It was argued on appeal by a predecessor of ours at the military law office, Bill Schaap. The appeals court held that our client was denied his right to a public trial, thus avoiding having to deal with the nuclear weapon question. I have always remembered since then that raising a political defense may be a responsibility, but giving a court some kind of procedural means to avoid addressing the politics can be the path to victory. I'll conclude with this last point. Jules Lobel wrote a book called Success Without Victory. In it, he suggests we move past the winner-take-all model and learn valuable lessons from legal and political activists who have advocated causes destined to lose in court but have had important, progressive, long-term effects on American society. As people in the military should know, losing a battle doesn't mean losing the war. And we can have a role in giving our clients, who will be critical players in future struggles, the courage to fight for ultimate victory. I hope this is a little bit helpful. I'm sure others will give you better information about much of this stuff. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Okay. Sorry, something happened to the audio here. Okay. So anyway, thank you so much to David. I really appreciate him sharing and recorded messages. We'll have a little bit of a shift in our schedule for today, just because I think one of our presenters got confused in which block he's talking on. So we may be a little bit flexible for these next two blocks. But I want to mention anyway, our next block, what we're into now, session number 5, is we're exploring the question of resistors, their discussion of military resistance. And so Jonathan may join us later, but we do have on Jeff Paterson. And to share a little bit about Jeff Paterson, let me pull, and he also is like many of the speakers today is a close personal friend. But Jeff, a little bit of a bio about him. He is a Marine Corps veteran. And in 1991, just a reminder, if you're not talking, if you could please, that would help. I'm gonna go ahead and do it this way. And again, if you're talking, it's fine, unmute yourself, but otherwise, just control the background sound noise. Okay, so anyway, Jeff Paterson is a Marine Corps veteran and 1991 Gulf War military objector and is a co-founder and longtime director of Courage to Resist. So he'll be sharing about his experiences, not only as a resistor, but also in supporting resistors over the years. I'll be sharing as well some practical thoughts on helping resistors, and I'll be speaking as an attorney, but also as someone who's been involved in some of the other aspects of supporting resistors as well. Personal support, from a religious standpoint, more of what you might call pastoral support, and also engaging with activist organizations, media folks, just kind of the whole picture of how we can support resistors through their journeys. So let me hand it off to Jeff for a bit.
Thank you, James. I'm assuming when you're talking about somebody being confused, you're talking about me, because I'm always confused about stuff. But yeah, so Jeff Paterson, I joined the Marine Corps 1986, right out of high school. I wanted to be a badass, kill people, kill bad guys. But 4 years later, I found myself facing deployment to Kuwait, and I no longer believed in what I was doing. That led me to publicly refuse to fight in Desert Storm. And that sort of informed my experience years later, co-founding an organization called Courage to Resist out of Oakland, California. And the objective with Courage to Resist has always been to provide GI objectors with 3 things: legal representation, not that we would represent them, but we would find attorneys and resources to hire attorneys to do that. Give them give them personal support, moral support, be there for them, share our experiences, learn from them. As people have said this morning, it can be a very isolating situation because one day, you are a member of a battery or a company of 100 plus individuals, and you're part of the team, and then all of a sudden, you're ostracized, and many of your best friends, no longer are your friends at all, that are threatening you. That kind of situation. And then finally, public advocacy to, when it's possible, use those cases to point out some larger thing in society. This war bad, for example. This is probably not the crowd that I need to be saying this to, but usually when I'm talking to attorneys that are thinking about these types of cases, or helping out in these types of situations, of military war resistors or military law in general of progressive causes. People are facing military repercussions for matters of conscience in general. The main thing I want to try to say is don't dismiss out of hand the opportunities for positive collaboration with advocacy groups and activists such as myself, because doing so you can much better serve your client that way. Public attention was one thing that's, sometimes it's something you're looking for, sometimes it's not. And definitely moral and emotional support for the client. Any attorney knows that they don't want to be the only emotional moral pillar for a particular individual, because you actually have another job, which is legal representation as well. And of course, money. Obviously, pro bono representation is great, but there are so few attorneys doing this work, you can't ask them to do all of the work for free all the time. So advocacy organizations can raise a few $1,000s that make the difference. In one extreme situation that I managed of the WikiLeaks whistleblower Chelsea Manning, all right, we raised over $2 million and spent, I don't know, about 2/3 of that on legal representation. So that's significant, meaning that no matter what the mountain is, it's possible to climb it and to accomplish that. As an activist, there needs to be a general understanding between the military objector, the client, the legal, the attorney, and an advocacy. We need to know what our lanes are, who has responsibility for what, and try to respect everybody's opinions and whatnot. So one big challenge is often over information, for example. And, I become aware of information, and then, I'm trying to get media, for example, to get hooked into this case. And I'm trying to give as, quote unquote, as much information to the media as possible. And oftentimes, not oftentimes, but it's common for that to become a gray area of insider information or just trying to get the media interested. And when you're talking to advocacy groups, activists, they do have to generally share the same motivations as the client, as a service member. If you have a service member, who really just is protesting, any vegetables at eating too many vegetables, then PETA is not. You can't have PETA help out, for example. And also the client, people have spoken. They need to be very much informed of the different repercussions of different actions. So we call it informed resistance. They need to be getting into. They need to know what they're getting into. So what happens if I don't do that? We don't center the motivations of the service member. We don't give an idea of informed resistance. And let's say I'm just like a political agent, and I have a political outcome I want to achieve, and I'm just going to get to it, and I'm going to I need to impose my outlook on this. Well, I've seen that happen, and it just turns into a shit show very quickly. It doesn't work. There's no magical shortcut to that happening. So it's not about this is a good thing to do. It's really the only thing that will actually work in even the medium term, long run. So cases I've witnessed, been a part of, advocacy for Pablo Perez, Kevin Benjamin, Stephen Funk. It was great watching Stephen Collier in the New Orleans courtroom years ago. Aaron Wattada, a very big case in the Pacific Northwest, first officer to refuse to fight in Iraq. And again, a great legal victory in the sense that he publicly spoke out, international news, and never spent a day in jail. And never spent a day in the break for that. Going to Canada, advocating for our U.S. service people who took refuge in Canada, and many of them are still leading great lives with family up there in Canada today. Chelsea Manning, Reality Wiener, one of the more common, one of the more recent, larger cases. And so, in a nutshell, the main thing I've learned over the years is not to try to directly apply my personal experience to any given situation, because the military is so opaque, and so things can change day to day. For example, I filed my conscience objector application with my commanding officer on August 16th, and 14 days later, all of the investigations were done, and the Pentagon denied me. So 14 days. That usually takes 14 months. But when the military wants to do something, they can get it done. But that's not common. And I can't assume that my motivation or outlook is shared by a resistor. No matter when it's super obvious to me, that's what they should be doing, or a particular strategy. So don't discount advocacy, because sometimes it can be all the difference in the world and to the outcome. Give us a chance. But yeah, right. If you're talking to a crazy guy, activist, maybe they're crazy. I can't speak for all of us, but give us a chance is what I'm saying. So thanks, James, for doing this fantastic panel today.
Yeah, I'll touch on a few things, kind of piggybacking off of what you shared. And again, my role has been on the other side of it, of being mostly on the lawyer side of it. And I've learned a lot as far as working in partnership with a lot of different people when doing military work. And in full disclosure, I've worked a lot with Courage to Resist over the years. But I've also worked with other activist groups, several of the GI coffee houses, but especially Under the Hood. I've worked some more lately with Veterans for Peace, and of course, with About to Face Iraq and Afghan veterans against the war. I've worked with them on cases as well, and I can tell you some things to kind of how to have the best experience working with these activist organizations. And one of them is having clear expectations from the get-go. And I like what you said a moment ago about everyone knowing what their lane is. And that comes from communication. And so one bit of advice I would give to any lawyer working with resistors and in this kind of stuff is cultivating positive relationships with the activist groups you're working with. And it can be tricky, though. I'll share some of those complications. One, of course, is the issue of information. So often there are very delicate negotiations in a military, particularly in a court-martial context. And there are elements of the negotiations, if those were leaked out early, such as what is the cap on a court-martial, when the sentence that's set, as we've talked about in one of the other sessions, about when would that cap the judge can't hear about that, obviously ahead of time. You'd have a mistrial if it was known. And so because of that, there is some challenging dynamics. What I do suggest, though, is by having conversations well in advance with the activist groups you're working with and explain, we won't be able to tell you everything about how the case is going, but having this relationship of trust so they know that you're not going to expose the organization to embarrassment unnecessarily, that everyone kind of knows what's going on, and that you have compatible missions is really important. Another thing, though, from a legal ethics standpoint, is who decides what happens in a case. And so from a legal ethics standpoint, the first and most important boss, you might say, is the client. They have to stay in the driver's seat. And I don't think this has happened a lot, but I think the potential is always there of what happens when the activist supporting organization has one agenda, the client has another. In that case, as the lawyer, I have to defer to what the client wants. Now, the one exception is that under the ethics rules, lawyers do get to determine strategy. Now, in my opinion, usually strategy and outcome still are so integrally tied together that it's very rare that I would pursue a strategy that my client wouldn't be comfortable with, no matter what the ethics rules say. Because my concern would be I need them to be on board, and also the belief that generally how we accomplish things, the the means need to be consistent with the ends as much as possible. And so, but outside those boundaries, the client makes the final call. And so to avoid problems, one of it is it's a matter of vetting to determine for the client, are they a good fit for this organization? Would this be a compatible relationship or not? And sometimes it isn't. And I've had cases where someone I really wanted to work with, and I did not know any activist group that would support them. And so sometimes I had the card conversation with the client to say, well, I really want to take your case. Your politics aren't like mine at all, but I feel really for you, but you're going to have to come up with the money yourself because I don't have an organization that'd be a good fit for you. Sometimes there are. I will say in the current era, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's a growing number of more right-wing resistors of various kinds. People who, for instance, are opposed to COVID vaccines, things like that. And for myself, I generally don't take those cases. I try to be very upfront with my clients to say, look, I'm political, you're political, we all have goals here. It needs to be something compatible. So maybe I'm not the best fit for your case. Sometimes I've had clients, though, who I am a fit in one aspect, I'm not a fit in another. And so we have to have those conversations to try to flesh out what that all means. I would say things that I would say from learning from bad experiences. One is I do strongly think, particularly for most resistance cases, lawyers need to be working with a team. I don't think a lawyer can effectively also be a good PR person at the same time. They can't be a good personal support person. Those are really separate roles. And so the sooner we can cultivate those relationships, the better. So anyway, we have another speaker who may be on a little bit, who isn't right now. So in the meantime, I thought we might open it up for some questions. And then Jeff, you and I, and others on the call today, we might move in some different directions and talking about this some more of what the support of resistors looks like in practical terms. And also, what might this look like in the future? How could it be changing? I think one of the things, and I was thinking about this a lot because of David's video at the beginning, he was involved with these legal projects that were physically located overseas where U.S. troops were stationed at. And that was also happening at the same time that there was a tremendous amount of physical presence of organizers in many U.S. stateside military bases, the coffee house movements, where they literally located right there by a base. The world is very different now. Those kind of physical presence situations are not such a big deal. Today, it's the online side is where most of this kind of organizing is happening. And so I think one for us to have some conversation and thinking about what that might look like, how it might look like in the future. So does anyone have some questions or some things we'd like to talk about in the rest of our time here for this session? And also, if you don't want to talk out loud with your question, if you want to put it in chat, that would be great too. And Siri, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in a little bit because I know that you've worked for a long time with some of the activist groups we're talking about. So I'm curious if you might have some thoughts too from the standpoint of being in doing those other kinds of support. What would you like for lawyers, GI rights counselors, others to know about engaging with activist groups on cases?
Yeah, for sure. So I was thinking that what David was saying about we need to stay connected from generation to generation, which I believe the problem is how we communicate that and how we are actually able to share that stuff in a way that the generation before is able to pass on what they learned without making it be a burden or a critique of the next generation, but in a way that it's useful. And I don't think that, and I think that what is clear is that we all need each other in this, that the military resistance is something that is a tiny little, I mean, I remember folks coming back from Vietnam and folks coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who felt convinced that if only people knew, then they would understand and we could stop this shit. Sorry for my language, and we have, but what we're up against is something that has deep pockets that can pull out and pay for a lot of tricks that it's hard for us to come up with. So I think that even when we are irritating each other because we come from different places and in our lives and in so many things, that we need each other. And so this is this conversation that we're having here is important because you can see the difference in the voices that legal people bring and that the activist people bring. But those are, we each have something really essential to bring. And for the resistors of each generation, they truly need our support because they are coming from these very isolated moments where, everybody is doing that themselves. And I don't know, something's making noise at me over here, but those are hard moments, and those are things that I will never lose my real admiration for people who were able to be in those situations and think through them and decide to change their minds, and they have a lot to teach us. Oh, it's my freaking oxygen. Sorry, everybody. Forget it. Okay. Sorry.
Well,
Very dramatic. I'll let you go on while this is making this noise.
sure. Well, we had a question in the chat. Someone asked about the comment about PTSD among resistors, particularly those who have PTSD from the consequences. And when I heard this question, I immediately thought of one of my public resistor cases from the past. And this was someone who ended up with a year in prison as the sentence, due to some mistreatment in the confinement facility he was in. Really, one of the very few cases actually of my clients who was mistreated in confinement. Generally, I tell most of my clients, jail sucks no matter what. But if I had to pick, if I was being sent to a county jail, a state jail, a federal prison, or a military brig, I'd pick the brig any day. Comparatively speaking, the chances of physical violence are lower than in many civilian facilities. There's a lot of things that are better, sadly, than in civilian facilities. But this was an exception. And so we went public about that. I ended up meeting with the base command, no, not the base, but the brig commander about it. And because of that, we also did what's called a request for the convening authority on the original court martial to reduce the sentence because of the mistreatment. And so when he ended up doing about 9 months in jail instead of 12 months. But I remember when myself and another activist went and picked him up from jail, he immediately wanted to get a cell phone and just some basic toiletry items because he'd been in jail for a year and he didn't have those things. And we took him to Walmart or Target someplace just to buy a cheapo cell phone and some basic toiletry items. And he started spinning out. It was too many decisions. And he told me later, said, James, for a year, I didn't get to make any decisions. And all of a sudden, you're asking me to pick out a cell phone and pick out shampoo and conditioner. And I haven't done that in a year. And then after that, myself and the client and the activist friend, we stayed in that area for about a week to do some outreach, talking about his case. And during that week, it was rough. And I stayed in touch with him after that. He said, even the next year or so was pretty rough. There was a fair amount of trauma symptoms he had experienced of PTSD. And this was someone, by the way, who'd previously done a combat deployment. So, and yet for him, that year in prison really, or 9 months in prison, really hit him hard. And it gave me a lot more of an appreciation for the fact that different people experience things in different ways. I know other of my clients who do time in prison, and it ends up not being bad. Like one of my clients, he said, I spent my whole time playing chess. Everyone called me the professor because I was really good at chess and I had nerdy looking glasses. And his time was relatively good. Other people, it's horrifically bad. And again, it depends where people are, what they've experienced. And another factor to remember with PTSD or anything like that is that trauma often accumulates and it gets worse over time, but particularly with recurrent exposure. And so, for instance, someone who may have had a fairly sheltered life when younger, their experience of hitting trauma might have the shock and surprise of someone who had never been traumatized before. But at the same time, they may experience it differently than someone who had been previously traumatized. It could be a whole lot worse. And so, for those reasons, it can be pretty rough. And I would say, in all frankness, in this conversation about resistance and supporting them, one of the things is actually we have to have some conversations sometimes about suicide prevention. And as a lawyer, this of course makes me very uncomfortable because my training is on the legal side. They didn't talk about this in law school; it never came up. And so this was something I thankfully in seminary we did talk about suicide prevention. I did have some training and experience there, which was very helpful. But all the same, it can be really hard. And I guess the only things I would say on that subject beyond getting training, if you can, to have at least some basic skills. But the most important thing is being ready to refer to appropriate mental health professionals, which that is easier said than done for someone who is on base. They can't just go down to behavioral. They can, but it could lead to all kinds of other problems. And so, cultivating good relationships with therapists and others like that can be really useful. So, anyway, Matthew, thank you for that question. Jonathan, I have you back on here, and actually, I think it's about time for us to shift gears and for you to speak. Jeff and I have been speaking. This session is on the about let me read the title again. This session is discussing resistors' discussion of military resistance. So talking about it from the standpoint of resistors. Jeff has spoken about his experiences as a resistor, but also his experiences in working with resistors with Courage to Resist. And then I've been sharing a little bit about working with different activist groups and also some of those experiences. And so, Jonathan, if you would like to, we have about 15 minutes or so left. And so if you'd like to speak some about your experiences as a resistor and what you would want activists and lawyers and other people like us to know about the experience of being a resistor.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I don't know why my screen is not allowing me to
Actually, you might check on your computer. Do you have a laptop or a desktop computer?
I do have a laptop, yes.
Okay, look at the top of your I wonder if there's a little slider turns in front of the camera. Check at the top. Sometimes, like I'll show you on mine.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I think I did this before.
Okay, well, it's worth a try.
Yeah, no, you're right. No, there's a slider in front of my camera, but I don't know how to slide it, man.
I mean, the other thing you might check is down at the bottom where it shows on Zoom. There's a little which says video. And do you see the like if you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you see it says video and like what I'll do is I can show you actually. I'll turn on screen share for a moment so you can see on my screen what this looks like, except no, it looks different now. Anyway, down at the bottom, there'll be this okay, so it'll be at the bottom for you, but see this says video. Click on that little caret thing by it. And then from there, and then select the appropriate camera. Just see if that works. If it doesn't, we won't worry about it. But
yeah, by the time I do all that, the thing will be over, right?
Don't worry about it. We'll just go ahead and go for it. Man.
Yeah. So hey, Jonathan. So there's a couple things I'll say about military resistance from my experience. One of the things I'll say is that, active duty resistance has a very strong qualitative aspect. Active duty resistance has a strong qualitative aspect, especially from the enlisted ranks, and especially when it is initiated by the directly impacted. Not when we had nearly 3,000 appeal signers. The appeal for redress was launched in the fall of 2006. This was October 24th, 2006. The appeal for redress was launched by 3 active duty service members, Lindsey Burnett out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Liam Madden out of Quantico, Virginia, myself based in the Navy out of Norfolk, Virginia. Liam Madden had a few months left on his contract. He was a Marine. And then Lindsey Burnett was active duty Army, a mass communication specialist in the Army with the 101st Airborne. So not when we had 3,000, nearly 3,000, not when we had even 500. When we launched in late October 2006, and when we got up to 65 signatures, we didn't even have 100. We had 65 appeal signers, mostly in the States, but a few on the ground in Iraq. The White House press secretary for George Bush at the time, he was a former Fox News personality. Cannot remember that guy's name, golden hair. But if you watch the 60 Minutes segment about the appeal, his name was Snow. Tony Snow was his name. Tony Snow. They asked Tony Snow about the appeal for redress in the White House briefing room in terms of addressing these 65 active duty signers. Now, to be candid, the environment was very ripe for what we were doing. This was 2006. This was 3 years after the initial invasion. This was 3 years where the corporate media, the corporate press, and it's very key that I frame it this way. They felt burnt by the Bush administration because of how the Bush administration sold the war in Iraq, and particularly how it was sold to the people, particularly from Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell going before the United Nations with that little test tube, saying that this little test tube justifies mass murder, mass bombings, what have you. He didn't say mass murder, but that's essentially what it was. The corporate media felt pretty burnt by this, and so there was a thirst within the corporate media to leverage what we were doing to push back upon the Bush administration. So I want to put that out there. It also was right because the American electorate at the time, it was very clear was going to vote more towards the Democratic Party, hoping that the Democrats would do something about it. We found out later that they would not, but that was the hope. And the House and the Senate actually flipped off of the anti-war movement at the time. All that being stated, the qualitative aspect was very, very strong. So I want to state that. I also want to state that we found out the leverage of DoD regs. We also found out the limitations of DoD regs, right? So there's a limitations of DoD regs. I mean, you can't speak ill of your commander in chief if you have or what have you. But as long as you're off base, out of uniform, speaking on your own behalf, and within the domestic United States, then you can participate in mass demonstrations, what have you. That's the military. That's DoD Directive 1325.6, which governs activities of the military personnel, active duty. In fact, they called it, back then the framing was dissonant activities, they called it. I think also, again, this limitation of using your congressional member. On one hand, it's not used enough. At the same time, we were able to leverage progressive members of Congress to come forward who, again, felt burnt by the Bush administration, some of whom had opposed the war from the beginning, those like Dennis Kucinich, for example, out of Ohio, and others from the Progressive Caucus who felt burnt by the administration, leveraged what we were doing to come out front to support the appeal for redress. Within a year, we had the entire Progressive Caucus of the House of Representatives supporting what we were doing. That was by the end of 2007. I think what we also learned was that the chain of command, while they respected us using DoD regulations, there was still going to be some retaliation, okay? In this case, our first act of retaliation was a linguist based out of Fort Meade by the name of Tassie McKee. This was a linguist who came to the United for Peace and Justice demonstration in January of 2007. She was an out front appeal for redress signer. There's a historic photo of us on that front banner, United for Peace and Justice. In fact, what I may do is pull that link and throw it in the chat, a link to talk that was given at Gwen Mercer University about a year ago where I spoke on this and I highlight that photo. But in that photo is Tassie McKee on that front banner. She made a statement at that demonstration, United for Peace and Justice, January 07. She made a statement against the war and support the appeal for redress. And when she got back to Fort Meade, Maryland, she was locked out of her office. Her security clearance was stripped. Her admittance to her building was stripped. And she was before her commanding officer answering questions as to why she made that statement. We got in touch with the inspector general immediately. We was able to, after some struggle over a period of time, it feels like it was about a month, we was able to get her back her assignment and get her back her clearance, but her relationships, a number of them were burnt personally, but she felt emboldened by the action, and she continued to press forward. She ended up joining Iraq Veterans Against the War and continued to organize. There was another active duty service member, Mark Train, out of I think he was out of Fort Gordon. He was on his way to Iraq. He was on that banner as well, and he ended up going AWOL. He did not go to Iraq. He went AWOL. I believe he went to Canada. There was another active duty signer, a National Guardsman by the name of Brian Hill, who's on that banner, United for Peace and Justice. And Brian wrote a very candid and direct piece to the producers of 60 Minutes before they aired our piece. 60 Minutes aired a piece about the appeal for redress in February 2007. You can Google that. But Brian wrote a piece that really hits upon the principle of conscientious, I call it conscientious, I frame it as conscientious and intentional risk-taking. What I mean by that is that, our activism, at least in today's period, is not always, and I say this not so much as a criticism, but I do say it as a critical observation, a very critical observation for one coming from within, right? Is that a lot of the activism that is highlighted out front within the corporate media, but even within progressive channels, to the degree that we consider them progressive, it will highlight what I call celebrity activists, folks who, while we deeply appreciate their commitment to the cause, they're not losing much, or if anything, by their commitment. I mean, how much risk taking? And again, I'm not saying this as a criticism, but think about what I'm saying. How much risk taking is involved when a Danny Glover speaks out? How much risk taking is involved when a Dennis Kucinich speaks out? I mean, how much risk taking is involved when Jesse Jackson speaks out, right? Versus a Tassie McKee who loses her security clearance, or Mark Train who has to decide after he speaks out if I'm going to Iraq or not, or Brian Hill who is a National Guards member, right? Trying to figure out what my chain might do to me as a result of this, right? That ultimately, that in order for us to really move the needle, what the appeal for redress was attempting to do was be a spark and catalyst to move those persons who actually can turn the guns around and put them down, and to actually bring warships to a halt, right? That's the legacy of a Susan Schnall, for example, right? I mean, that's the legacy of an Andy Stapp in the American Service Members Union, right? I mean, that is the legacy that the appeal for redress was building upon, is in using and leveraging those DoD regs to then build to enhance and to sharpen, if you will, the political consciousness, the political awareness, and then ultimately to bring it to the level of intentional risk-taking, intentional and conscientious risk-taking. Nearly 3,000 members signed the appeal for redress. It was a simple patriotic statement that I can read, that I can paraphrase from, but basically it was a statement that stated that as a patriotic American proud to serve the nation in uniform, we respectfully ask our service members to remove all bases and service members from Iraq. The war in Iraq is not working and is not worth the price. It's time for U.S. service members to come home. It was signed by nearly 3,000, spanning 10 countries across the globe. Our largest base of appeal signers was in Germany, and we was able to tap into some some GI movement veterans there that was very helpful to our cause and to the cause, right? I think seeing the legacy of it today, when we have service members in today's time right now who are leveraging that legacy against the genocide, and we do say genocide, that's taking place in Palestine, in occupied territories, in occupied areas. That we're reminded that we're reminded that at the end of the day, and I'm going to close here, is that we're none of us are who we say we really are. Not really. Like most people profess to be certain things. At least some people do. I'm a Christian. I'm a Muslim. Now, at the end of the day, we are what we do, right? And so what the appeal for redress was saying to people is that that there's a simple act you can take. You can click on this link that we're going to send you. You can sign this letter. You can send it to your Congress member, and tell them to do something about this issue to end these wars in Iraq. One last thing I would say is that while I mentioned the 60 Minutes broadcast to be watched, another piece on the appeal that was really good, very well done, was Nation Magazine did the front page piece on the appeal for redress in January of 2007. It was called About Face, the growing anti-war movement within the United States military. And that piece was solid. It actually interviewed about 20 plus appeal signers on the ground in Iraq. And what was interesting about those interviews was the myriad of reasons, I end with this, as to why they signed the appeal. Oftentimes movements are described as being highly ideological, sometimes even sectarian, monolithic, and none of that is true. You read those appeal signers' reasons. Some of them appeal signers agreed they believe, however rightly or wrongly, that Saddam Hussein was a dictator. Some agreed with overthrowing him. Some just wanted to get out of Iraq because they were sick and tired of seeing their comrades killed. Some believed that it was a war that couldn't be won. Some were just sick and tired of being away from their families for so long. The burnout was deep. And then some was ideological. Some was ideological as well, right? Some people that were career minded that were signing the appeal, some that weren't. A few officers that were signing the appeal. One of them was on 60 Minutes with us. He was a doctor. He was an '06, an '05, which is a commander in the Navy, right? Who's a doctor, a surgeon, who signed the appeal for redress. So to spread the of persons and the myriad of reasons they signed still stays with me. And so I end with that. And if anybody have any questions, I'm around for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just wanted to mention how much I appreciate both you and Jeff being able to speak of your experiences. It helps so much for those of us who are not veterans to hear your experiences. So we do have about 7 minutes before our next session starts. So if anyone has questions on this topic, feel free to unmute yourself and go for it. Otherwise, we'll be starting our next session in about 7 minutes. So. And also should mention for this hour, I put it in the chat as well, but we didn't get to have the codes you need to claim CLE credit. The letters for this session are D as in Delta, and Z as in zebra. D as in Delta, Z as in zebra. So you'll need those codes if you're watching online and want your attorney needing CLE credit. And also, I mentioned in the chat, we previously had Susan Schnall scheduled for this time. She unfortunately had to cancel due to a health situation with a family member, but we'll really appreciate that she was willing to talk, and hopefully we'll include her in a future presentation down the road. And also, I mentioned in the chat, we had some really good conversation going on. So if you have a chance to look through the chat, you might take a look at that. Oh, Jonathan, we can see you now.
Yeah, I figured this thing out finally at the end. It was some little screen blocker or some shit. Excuse my language.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's cool, y'all. You heard me. You got everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, I see the appeal for redress banner behind you.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
incredible.
I got my light on back here. It's my man cave. I got the light on back here. It's kind of blurring it. Yeah, I finally figured it out, James.
Wow, that's incredible.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, shit.
I'm trying
See,
to
I
find
was,
that article on at the Nation. So, do you have a link to it, Jonathan, by any chance?
if you stick around real quick, I'm gonna find it. Let me see if I can find that link. If you go to Google real quick and just let me see how I minimize my screen, and then let me see. Okay, let me see.
I'm going to
Okay,
be back in just one moment. We'll be starting next session 5 minutes. I'm going to real quick hit the restroom. I'll be right back.
let me drop the Nation magazine article called "Nation Magazine Appeal for Redress." Nation Magazine. Oh, hmm. Here we go. Yeah, I got it. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Just had to play around with the wording a little bit. Blase, blase. Whoop-de-whoop. Oh. Okay, then get back on there. I get you Zoom people back here. Okay, here we go. Chat. Yep. I'll drop it for you in the chat. There it is. Oh, check it out. Okay. Yeah, about face soldiers call for Iraq withdrawal. Yeah, I just dropped it in the chat. Yeah, that was a good piece. It was solid. Yeah, check it out. Yeah. Okay.
I'm
Question.
okay.
All right, well, it was cool. Talk with you good people, and I'll catch you in the sweet by and by. Peace and love.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right, take care.
Many thanks.